So the learning outcomes for this session is to help you to be able to understand the difference between the medical and social models of disability. I want to provide some opportunities here also for to look at your own instructional practices and how they may create barriers for learning, to really reflect on some of your personal beliefs about learners, and hopefully challenge some of those in your own practice. And so before we go into all the sessions, I really want everyone to take a moment here, just to situate yourself, maybe actually go into your body, something we don't do too often before we go in there and see, how are you feeling? How is, do you have thoughts going on in your head? And really think about the place that we're in. And this is the place for me that I work, and that I live and that I learn. And I like to take a moment to acknowledge that I'm in Calgary, which means the places that I learn in are the traditional territories of the Treaty 7 of Southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, which includes the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley's First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. And you might be wondering, why am I the person doing this session today? And I want to give you a little bit of a sense of how I come to this topic, and to give you a sense of how that coming to the topic gives you a sense of where I speak on ableism, where my knowledge reference are, and where we would go to others maybe who have more expertise at times. I've spent most of my life as a learner. It's hard to imagine a time when I wasn't in some sort of formal education, whether continuing education, graduate school, as such. But as a learner, depending on the context of how we were being taught and assessed, I would at times have to label myself as disabled to be able to access the supports that were crucial to my success. At times, I'm also a sessional instructor. This means at times I am the instructor. I'm in a position of power. I get to decide how are we taught, how are they graded, and I control many aspects of that learning environment. And I also come to you here in my current day-to-day job, which is with student accessibility services. I don't speak for the whole department, but I work in an area that is very much tied to a medical model of disability, and in many ways is involved in upholding the ableist institution that I may critique. And so it's from these multiple positions that I've kind of come to speak to you. And we're focusing mainly on students, but when we talk about ableism and we talk about these challenges, I want to also acknowledge that ableism doesn't just impact students. The ableist institution impacts the employees, the faculty in many ways. That is just outside of the scope of this presentation. So when we think or often start talking about access, ableism, we often rely on metaphors of space. And I think that this would be an interesting starting point for us as well. So to really think about going to the areas of space, what spaces do you associate with learning in a post-secondary environment? So this is your chance to go into Mentimeter and take a look and see what kind of word cloud we can create. And as they get responses, they change their size and organization here. And in this variety of options that you're highlighting for us here, it's important for us to think about who belongs in these spaces. What are some of the assumptions that are in these spaces here? With online, I see there are questions of, assumptions around access to internet and technology. You can see here labs as one that emphasizes, a set height, ability to stand for long periods of time. And central to all of this has been the library. So again, this idea that learning occurs through reading the work of others and accessing the work of others rather than doing. And so these are kind of some of the topics that lead us in to really think about what is implicit as we go along the way. And thank you everyone for sharing. So yesterday I went to our main website of the University of Calgary, and I saw this image on the front page. And I think this speaks quite a bit to us in terms of how we present ourselves to others and how we create, design spaces and learning for certain mind bodies and not others. Many of you might recognize this space. This is the space that is the atrium in the administration building. Maybe you've gone there. It's quite a popular space. But what I wanted to do in this case is take a moment and highlight to you to whom this space may not seem welcome. We've assumed this space for, in many ways, an able body. There are no handles on these chairs. They are a particular set. If you had back pain, it wouldn't work. There are high tables. It's a noisy space, right? There isn't much acoustic dampering in there. It's a bright space. It's an example too of a retrofit as we see this long ramp in the image sort of placed in what was clearly anticipated as a set of stairs. And so these are all ways that a space, the spaces that we teach and we have our students learn in, can indicate to them that they don't belong. And while at the same time privileging others to say that they belong in those spaces. And that is not to say there are other questions of who belong in this space that are outside the scope of this presentation regarding race and gender that also come through in this image. And that's why hopefully you signed up to come to here, is to talk about ableism. And ableism really is a way of understanding the unspoken norm that we privilege and that we design for. And so it's a recognition of this assumption of normalcy, of an able-bodied mind that underpins how we construct our learning spaces, our classroom techniques, our ways of sharing information to students and allowing them to share to us, and who is privileged in that relationship. And so in this way, we see many ways the post-secondary education promotes a hegemonic ideal of humanity, one that designs and privileges notions of autonomy and independence. And at the same time, it signifies as others bodies that do not meet this ideal. And so rather than focusing on the other, ableism really challenges us to think about who are our tacit assumptions of what we're designing for? Who are the students that we assume are in our classrooms and those assumed abilities that we bring in? And so often there's a talk about reaching to this ideal body mind. And I use the word body mind to recognize that it's not just an ideal body, but it's also the connection of the body and mind. And that allows us to bring in, other ways of processing information. And when we think about that, it's important to think about, there are certain bodies or ways of perceiving the world that are privileged in our classrooms. And I'm wearing a very good example. No one in a moment here, I think, would go up to a student and ask them to remove their glasses, right? This is a modification that we're all quite comfortable in recognizing. However, if a similar modification regarding captioning was required for a student who maybe perhaps needed more assistance in hearing, there would be a process of requesting this. There would be a process of marking that they were different because we don't design for that in mind. Similarly, think about, cell phones as something that we often restrict, but for diabetic students, this may be something that they use. It's part of their entire system regarding blood glucose management, but we stigmatize that as problematic rather than the glasses. And that's the gift I think ableism gives us, is to have us think and challenge these assumptions. And as a side note, when we talk about the able-bodied mind, we can get into this logic of sort of the hypernormal or hyper-able. And if those are questions that you're interested in, or you're interested in, how does body modification and that technology enter in these discussions? Well, you're quite lucky to have at our institution, Gregor Wolbring as the expert in that area, as someone who I would go to answer those questions. So taking a look at two models of disability here. The social model of disability we can see as connected to ableism. It's a way of looking at how is it a social construction, a social oppression on bodies that deviate from this ideal. Yet for the reality of my day-to-day work and many others, it's the medical model. The medical model is what is driven by human rights legislation in this province and most places. It's what guides the University of Calgary's legal responsibility or liability. It's also what guides provincial funding for bodies of students and to provide services for students who are labeled under the medical model as disabled. The medical model locates disability within the individual. It's an individual flaw. It's something that the medical model seeks to identify, label, construct, as well as fix and cure. This idea of trying to control these problematic bodies along the way and control them so that and mitigate them in various ways. It's also one that's very disempowering within our current system. The student is seeking accommodations. A student has to go identify and say, I am, according to our social organization, less than. And here is someone else coming to speak to me and to say, it's valid that I'm determining that I'm less than. In contrast, the social model helps us reflect that disability is constructed by society, and argues rather that what we label negatively as disability is in fact human variation that we are failing to account for. And that is the system that oppresses us. Social model also helps us understand how do individuals who have these human variations, how have they maybe internalized this negative association? So despite working in an area that mainly focuses on accommodations, I'm quite aware of the limitations of accommodations. And I would argue to you all here that accommodations are very much like these small wedges. These are retrofits for a stairway that was clearly not designed for everyone. Rather, they are the smallest gestures that allow us to go through and say that we've made an adjustment. And at the same time, there are signals to people that they don't belong here. We didn't have you in mind when we created this. You don't fit. At the same time, to look at getting accommodations, I do want to recognize the hardship, the effort, and work that is involved. In many ways, there's a whole discussion of virtue signaling in this. Students have to desire accommodation. They have to seek, they ask. We review and we grant them to students. And this has a huge chilling effect on the students who use accommodations. There's a large cost benefit that goes into every class and to determine whether or not you seek accommodations for it. Do the benefits offered by the accommodations outweigh the costs to their sense of self, to perhaps how they're perceived by their instructors and classmates? The further the chilling effect really happens too in terms of the standards and the challenges of even getting that outside documentation. And this is why when we look at rates of disability in high schools, in the general population, they do not even remotely match the number of students seeking those services in post-secondaries in Canada and the US. And I'll take this argument once more for you here. It's to argue that because accommodations are retrofits, they're kind of our way as an institution to say we've solved the problem. They're a way for us to continue to reify the norm while saying we've fixed it. And I'll give you one example here. When I first started to work at accessibility services in the exam center area, there was no button for people to enter into the area. You had to push the door. And I asked why that was when they renovated the space. Well, we had met our legal obligation by having it on the other door across the hall. You might have had to walk around the building if you weren't able to open the door, but that met the requirements. I think that is very telling of the notion of kind of accommodation. We will retrofit, we will meet these minimums, but at the same way indicate you don't fit, you don't belong. And ableism, I think, has a parallel to many other groups that we would call equity seeking or equity deserving. They are bodies that have been medicalized, that have been subjected to colonial sciences. We can think about this in the way that, we just define and construct boundaries of the body and intellect through things like IQ tests. They're bodies that are labeled as biologically inferior. These are groups which historically have been the object of study rather than the researcher. And this is something that, if we even look at our research in the university today, there are many people who would champion neurodiversity, but at the same time, we are studying it and looking at ways to sort of ameliorate it as a problem. So that tension still remains. And they have been labeled as other, as inferior. And I want us to recognize that the roots of the University of Calgary come from the Calgary Normal School, which was intent on teacher training and was focused on providing a norm or one size consistent education experience for all the students across Canada. I suspect as I've been talking about this, that many of you may have ways where we might have observed how our current system doesn't seem to work. That there are challenges that tell us that we shouldn't be assuming this able body mind of all students. And so I'd like to take you to go back to Mentimeter, and if there are indications from you on ways in which this assumption, you've seen little moments of where this may, or hints where this may not be the case. Now that you've all who've gone off to breakout rooms fluttered back in, thank you so much for engaging in this task that I put in front of you. And there are some very rich Jamboards here, so I'll leave them up as I highlight a couple of things that you guys have come across there. As noted on this board, this is an inherently individualist model, right? Learning is all the action of one person. There isn't really a coach or help in this model, right? Noted here too, right? The idea that, it's very much there's a power imbalance on who gives feedback, right? There isn't student-to-student learning. Also, if we, as this one highlighted so clearly, it assumes that, everyone has a goal and that there would be the same goal. And we can also see this as very much tied to a very notion of being productive, right? Like we have a goal, we achieve a goal, and it doesn't perhaps take a lot of time in that journey along the way. Right. It doesn't address the affective elements as an emotional, right? If you go into this deeper, there's a sense of that you need to have emotional control and control worry to engage as part of these learning strategies. There isn't really a place for, joy, passion, fear. Those aren't part of this model, and it's left out. And as many of you noted too, it's very hinged on what's called executive function or executive control. and promising this kind of notion of, cognitive function along the way. So even in this model that we use so often to talk about what students should be doing, we inherently have a lot of, we already have those assumptions. And yes, course outline, if there wasn't anything to tell someone they didn't belong, first off, it is that course outline piece. And I suggest as a practice here, one that I thought about encouraging people to do, but then I saw how many were registered, is look at your own course outline through this lens and see, who does it tell, how does it indicate a sense of belonging? Who does it say doesn't belong? And, often, teaching is a reflective practice. The TI often offers many moments to reflect. And in creating this, I wanted to reflect on some of the embedded notions I brought to teaching as a new instructor. And I didn't share PowerPoints. It was very vehement. And some of the false assumptions that I made about students, or about the fact that, or fears of handing them out, was I had assumptions around attendance, and that providing this material would drop attendance or engagement, rather than recognizing the notion of always being able to attend every single class. That model of I'm always well is not a reality. I had assumptions about note-taking abilities and students' abilities to process the information on the slide, as well as writing on the hand, writing it along the way. And I don't know if you got the slides ahead of time, but I very much tried to set them. So that assumption too, right, that people can process all of this information at the same time. And so reflecting on our practice and changing and adapting by going and asking ourselves, why do I assume that students should do this? Why do I prioritize this? And there are ways and moments in which we can look at shifting these assumptions by planning for diversity. One of the most common models for planning for diversity is often referred to as universal design for learning. And I very much promote this in many ways, but I also want to recognize, like anything, if you apply it without thoughtfulness, without addressing those assumed beliefs about ability, that we very much can create curb cuts to nowhere. We can create spaces that tick off boxes in terms of meeting a UDL criteria without engaging with it meaningfully. I also don't want you to all go and say UDL removes ableism, right? And then in that way, using universal design could be a way of hiding inequality by labeling as we're doing this. But building for diversity and thinking about multiplicity rather than aiming for that ideal body-mind can yield some unexpected consequences that are positive for letting many groups of people know that they are welcome in their community. And the one that I highlight here for you guys today in terms of late banks is one way that we can indicate, because I saw someone mention, well, what do we do if they need extensions? Recognizing that our assumption that students throughout our 12-week semester will not be tired, have a headache, get a cold, have family responsibilities, have a bad day in some way. That's a false expectation. So how do we build in the fact that the unexpected really should be the expected? And so late banks are one tool for that in terms of providing a way for students to know that they can just submit an assignment late, no explanation, no penalty, and building that in and indicating to students that. Rather than creating rigid rules of this is the test time, this is when it must be taken, recognizing. But if for some reason something happens, here is the deferral date. It is planned for, rather than them seeking out that information. How do you indicate that for, in my case, I always try to think about how do I indicate that I feel learning involves making mistakes? And how do I set that up as a way of telling people what kind of learning means to me and articulating it? And so these are ways that we can start to shift in our own teaching practice, building on these assumptions. And one that I work very hard with, despite coming from a background of writing instruction too, is to think about, how do I, does it have to be the primacy of that written word? Where can I have flexibility for students, and how can I start to acknowledge some of the ways that they feel that they express their learning and knowledge in the course? Because I want to leave time for questions, I won't make you go and do this on a Jamboard. But what I would say, hopefully the takeaway for the session for you is that ableism is a tool to really challenge us as instructors to think about how we teach. What is the underpinning assumptions of that? Where do we teach? What spaces are we teaching in? And who is invited and who is not necessarily invited in that area? And what governs our teaching? So those are the institution, the policies that we follow and create. And where do we have agency to resist? And I'll leave you on this note about belonging, as it is such an important idea. And that so often the spaces, this is from our classroom page yesterday, they indicate to people they don't belong. And fixing the built environment is a very important task, but it's a long task. So as instructors, where do you have agency to say, this is the space that I'm in, but what other cues can I give you to counteract that this belongs? Or as I often do in my work, to recognize the ableist institution and practices I participate in terms of work, but also to, I would say, present my discontent with them and to work on challenging them along the way. And when I show you this podium, which I'm sure you can see a podium, we have stacked seating, to recognize that many of our classrooms have beyond just the set of stairs. Think about how your classroom assumes everyone's right-handed. If you're in the science theaters, assumes that you can sit in a certain amount of seat, assumes that you're comfortable sitting in a room with up to over 100 people, something many of us may not be after a year of COVID. And those are some of those thoughts I'd like you to take away. Because when students belong, we have research that suggests that those who belong are more motivated to learn. They have higher self-efficacy belief in their learning. And as a result, they engage and set different kinds of learning goals and have persistence in that process that's differently. So we started talking about ableism, but really what I want us to talk about is how do we create classrooms that indicate that all of our students belong and recognize the many indicators that tell them that they don't. At this point, I would like to have Fuzia stop the recording, and we can allow people to ask questions, whether it be in the chat, whether it be put up your hand and speak, whatever ways work for you guys, or if perhaps maybe later on you have an idea, you're welcome to email me.